Welcome to another Vinimark podcast, where we engage in conversations along the rough edges of wine commerce, science, cellar mastery, marketing, and the rising trends amidst the industry's more adventurous pioneers. Today, we're going to be continuing the discussion surrounding the roles of women in wine, which covers both how we can improve the environment for women working in wine and also how the wine industry can better serve its female clientele, which many stats would say is the majority of wine consumers. So, to help us on this topic, I'm very excited to be chatting to a highly influential international voice in the world of wine and wine journalism, Felicity Carter. Felicity is a member of the Circle of Wine Writers and writes for everyone from The Guardian through to vinepair.com and was the editor in chief for winebusinessinternational.com. But perhaps most excitingly, at least for me, is that she is the executive editor for Pix.wine, which is a new project that I feel is the most revolutionary thing to happen to wine commerce since like the internet. So Felicity, thank you so much for joining me today. And I know we're here to discuss women in wine, but I would so love it if you could quickly just tell me a little bit about your role at Pix.wine and what it might mean for both South African producers and wine consumers globally.
Thanks, Jono. It's great to be here. Well, Wine is launching at the end of the year, and we're starting in the United States and then the UK. It's a wine search engine, so think of like booking.com, where you can go and find any wine and find out where it is, where it's located, how much it is, if there's a cheaper bottle near you, or if it's not available, something that you might prefer instead. So we have a magazine that's attached to it, which has already gone live. It's called The Drop, and I'm executive editor of that. And the idea of The Drop is to get people interested in engaging with wine in their life, basically. So we run a lot of stories about wines people might be interested in and wine culture. And for South Africa, I think it's really exciting because the United States, where it launches, hasn't yet had the love affair with South African wine that the rest of us have. And I think they're still in the discovery phase. And Pix is about helping people discover. So I think it could be great.
Okay, so talking about women in wine, there is a little bit of a backstory to today's topic. Vinimark hosted another Women in Wine webinar in October last year, and we were discussing some neurological studies that had been published in 2014. I came across one from the University of Rio de Janeiro, another from California, and another out of Sao Paulo. And all of these studies showed that women have up to 50% more neurons firing in their olfactory cortex than men do. Or put another way, 50% more potential brain activity in the area of processing smells. Now, it was not only that, but there were separate studies going as far back as 2002 that showed that women, specifically within reproductive ages, had an ability to dramatically increase the sensitivities to new aromas far faster than men did. They could also recognize those smells at lower concentrations. So, in one sense, women were proven to be far more adept at sensory learning. Now, at the time in October last year, this was news to me. But when I shared it with Jancis Robinson, who happened to be on the panel, she remarked, you've just taken a very long time to tell me what we've known for a very long time. So today, Felicity, I'm hoping you can help me figure out this. If we've all known this for a very long time, what are we supposed to be doing with this information that will result in the strengthening of the wine industry? Because my immediate assumption is that we should be loading up all of our tasting and judging and critical panels with the female majority. Are we seeing this happen?
Well, I'm going to give you a couple of answers to that. What should we do with this information? I think we should do exactly nothing with this information, and I'll tell you why. Having a potential to do something isn't the same as being able to do it. So if you think about something like running, for example, if you've got more collagen in your muscles and if you've got faster twitch muscles, then theoretically you should be a much better runner than somebody else. But that's of no use unless you've actually trained to run, or if you've got a champion's mindset. You may well actually be beaten by somebody who's less physiological able than you, but has spent more time training and thinking about training. So the fact that women have all of these neurological abilities, which I think is fairly robust information, I think we do, doesn't actually mean anything unless you do something with it. So a guy of 60 who's spent 40 years immersed in wine, who has knowledge and experience, will always beat somebody who may be physiologically better able to smell, but who doesn't have that knowledge and information. And it's a very dangerous road to go down for two reasons. One is that if you're younger, you'll always beat somebody who's older. So there's that. So it's very dangerous saying, what you should and should do based on the body. But secondly, there's a sort of very long and ugly history of using physiology to discriminate in various ways. It's called biological determinism, and it's often been used against women. Like in the 1970s, up until the 1970s, women weren't allowed to be airline pilots because it was assumed their body, their hormonal cycle meant that once a month they'd crash the plane. So I'd be very, very, very wary about saying anything about what we should or should not do in wine based on some perceived neurological potential, which is different from an actuality. As to the question of whether we should have women on more women on tasting panels, the answer is yes, but not for that reason. It's because we know that panels that are more diverse in terms of age, gender, ethnic groups will always outperform those that are more homogenous.
Okay, so we're saying that it is dangerous to use the information. Is it not possible that in the context of where we're sitting now, especially in South Africa, it is still a male-dominated industry? Is the message that at the very least there are level playing fields, but even more than that, there may be a sign that women have potential to perform better, is something that needs to be said simply to encourage those who perhaps thought they can never get involved because they don't have the ability?
I can't say this strongly enough. I think going down the road of saying, women's brains are structured so that we can be better at things. I think it has such an ugly history, and I can't emphasize it enough. Biological determinism was really what was behind a whole lot of eugenics and mass
Yes.
murder through the 20th century. So I don't think we should introduce it into wine. But you don't need that argument. All you have to do is you have to look internationally and look at what women are doing in the world of wine, to say that it would be folly of anybody to think that it should remain a male-dominated area. I mean, particularly in Britain, for example, which is still an extremely important global market, women dominate in terms of their roles as buyers and famous people like Jancis Robinson. So you don't need to leap into a biological argument. You can just point across the pond and say, look at how great women are performing in places like Britain.
South Africa, has an incredible lineup of women winemakers, and there was one assertion that women make wine in a completely different way to men, and as a result are producing wines that you can almost taste are feminine. Do you find this notion offensive, or do you think there's something in it?
I think all of the above. There are some biological differences between men and women. We know, for example, that in general, women don't like the high alcohols and some of the robust tannic wine that men tend to prefer. And so you would expect to see that women winemakers would value lower alcohol and more freshness. And in fact, one of the things that you're seeing internationally is you're seeing a move towards these type of wines, which may be a consequence of more and more women consumers, more and more people entering the industry. Whether we inherently make wine a different way, I think it's too early to tell. I think, you know what? I don't know is what I'm trying to say.
That's fair enough. I was also referencing some studies by Nielsen and by the Wine Market Council reporting that women around the world are actually buying more wine than men are. And in South Africa, there were voices saying, well, most likely that's because in our context, there are still more women doing the grocery shopping than men. But the more focused studies show that it's actually women buying and consuming wine. Do you think there's a logical link, therefore, to prioritize positioning women as buyers and curators for large retail chains, or do you think that too is a dangerous route to go down?
I do think it's a dangerous route. So first of all, we're talking about lots of different things here. If you're talking about the question of equity, is it right that women should participate in higher levels? The answer is, of course, absolutely. There's no reason at all to exclude women. If the argument is that women should dominate the industry because there are more consumers who wine, I would say no, for the same reason that you need lots of diversity in wine. So you don't need the dominance of any one group. As for women being more consumers, that's been true for more than a decade, and that holds true internationally. There's a lot of reasons why women are buying more and more wine, some of which has to do with marketing, some of which has to do with popular culture, some of which has to do with the mere fact that wine companies have found it extremely profitable to go after the female market. So if you looked at the statistics, internationally, you would actually say that wine is a female product much more than it is a male product these days.
So that in itself is an interesting assertion, just because if I look at the premium wine, especially in South Africa, and this is going purely on stereotypes, I'm very aware of this. The products themselves, their branding, their labeling, their brand language, all strikes me as quite staid, quite masculine. I feel like the assertion that wine is a female product, there's dissonance between that and what I see on shelves in premium wine sections. To me, that I feel like that should have been changing faster. Are we seeing that internationally?
Okay, so this comes to a much more complex issue. So it's always been considered true that women drink supermarket wine or crappy wine, basically, and that men drink fine wine. That the sort of the premium end is still very much a male product, and that in fact is true. If you talk to people who work at places like Sotheby's with the secondary market, or people who deal in fine wine, you will find that it's still predominantly men who buy sort of top end wine. But what's never been considered is that maybe this is a function of wealth rather than of gender. Now, if you look at Hong Kong and China, which only really started as wine markets around about 2008, it's very interesting that those wine markets began with the market leaders being two women. Deborah Meiberg and Jean Cholet, who are both masters of wine. And they were both there when those markets opened up, and they kind of defined the markets. And so those markets didn't start with any bias towards men, wine is for men or wine is for women. And today in fine wine in Hong Kong, 50% of the buyers are women. So this actually seems to have a lot to do with cultural expectations and money, much more than it does anything else. And I think what we'll find is that as women get wealthier, which is beginning to happen, that women will naturally move into this fine wine area. As to the question of whether you should change the cues on the packaging, whether they should be more female or more masculine, I actually my stomach kind of flips at this whole gender marketing thing. I dislike it strongly. I think that women will naturally gravitate to sort of find the fine wine area without needing to do special marketing or changing the packaging.
So do you feel it would almost be patronizing to begin to change those messages?
Very much so, yes. For some reason, wine marketers can't help themselves. As soon as they think about marketing for women, they start making horrible pink labels and really kind of dreadful things. So I think if we could have an area of wine that's not subject to that, that would be great.
So on that topic, I mean, your assertion there was that marketers get it wrong when they're trying to market towards women. Is this because we have a too narrow a view of femininity in society, or is it because there aren't enough women in creative director roles within creative agencies that work with wine companies?
This is a very complex issue. I'm very sorry to say that it's not to do with women involved in marketing, because quite often, if you look at some of the most patronising and awful products that have been made for women, they've actually been designed by female marketers. So about 10 years ago, there was an explosion of products of sort of wines for women, and they were called things like Skinny Bitch and stuff like that, and they were all devised by women. So having women in the driving seat doesn't necessarily result in better products. Let me tell you, gender marketing is very interesting. I personally find it extremely offensive, but it also happens to be very effective. It started in the 90s with toy marketing for children. There used to be gender neutral toys, and then people discovered that they could sell twice as many toys if they badged one as blue and one as pink. And so for the past 30 years, as marketers have realised that, we've had an explosion of this rebadging the same product in different ways to appeal to men and to women. Unfortunately, it's had a feedback loop where women now sort of subconsciously believe that they should only pick up products that have all of those sort of female cues attached to them, and vice versa. So I think the more that you do gender marketing, the more it reinforces itself.
That's fascinating, and the ramifications of that are huge. But Felicity, you've been writing in wine for over 20 years, and so you would have had a bird's eye view of the change that has been happening in a number of different contexts. I know that you work around the world. What would you say have been the biggest examples of progress that excite you the most?
They've all been incremental. The really big things that happened was things like the decline of Robert Parker's influence on wine. That was absolutely enormous. So, he really drove the market towards these ballbuster wines with sort of lots of fruit explosions and lots of tannins and lots of high alcohol. And I think the demise of that has had a huge impact on the market. We've seen this rise of sort of fresher, lighter styles. I think the most exciting thing at the moment is the fact that in the past year we've become much more, certainly here in Europe, much more conscious of other forms of diversity, of racial and ethnic equity as well. And I think that's going to have a fantastic impact on wine in the years to come.
But what are some other areas where you think that there's a large amount of work that needs to be done, and what is being done to or needs to be done to improve the experience of the female wine consumer?
Well, it depends on what you're talking about. So, if you're talking, and I'll ignore your question about female consumers for a second. I'll just talk about women inside the wine industry. The big change that it seems to me that still hasn't happened is that we still don't have women represented in areas like finance and logistics, which is where the power is. We have women very overrepresented in marketing, and we have very women underrepresented in owning land. So um, winemakers, there's more female winemakers as employees, but there's still very few women that own wineries or own their own land. And that's a really big thing. And that's partly because the sort of people that in their retirement or later in life who go and buy wineries tend to be men who've worked in very lucrative professions like banking or technology. And women, because women are still sort of excluded from those professions, it has a knock-on effect in acquiring land and actually becoming owners of wineries later. So I'd like to see the financial side of things a bit more even than it is. As for consumers, I think the thing that I would like to see the end of is a lot of wine companies have discovered that women are a really good consumer group. And so they pump out oceans of really crappy wines aimed at women. There's really nothing that's trying to get women into the fine wine area or the artisanal area. Of course, there's, in reality, there's loads and loads and loads of women who are involved in this area. But if we're talking about the vast mass of consumers, I think the marketing messages are still about selling women cheap whites, cheap and nasty rosés, and I'd like to see that change. I'd like to see women taken more seriously as consumers rather than being treated as cash cows.
I mean, I wonder why that is, though, because it's not like there is a lack of marketing of luxury towards women. So, what do you suppose it is about the wine industry specifically that has kept its voice to women at that level? It seems to be an anomaly.
It's prejudice, actually. And I've heard this many, many times in conferences. It's this idea that women drink at the supermarket level and men drink fine wine. And it's been assumed that this is talking about biology again, that this is a hard, fixed biological reality that despite the number of women who are becoming masters of wine, despite the number of women who are becoming wine buyers or whatever, that it is a fixed and rigid thing that men like fine wine and women drink kind of crappy supermarket wine. And it's an assumption. And you can see, like I said, you can see in Southeast Asia, this is not true. It all depends on the market orientation, whether it's inclusive, and it also depends on wealth. And as women become wealthier, there's nothing in fine wine that's inviting them in, which I find extraordinary.
But then we have this circle problem, and what you talked about, in Southeast Asia, there is this amazing scenario where, as the wine culture developed, women were there at the forefront, and so it developed as a fairly egalitarian wine culture. But we're now saying that yes, women are beginning to earn more, but there's nothing to draw them in to fine wine culture, which means they're less likely to enter fine wine culture, which means that there's less likely to be something to draw them into fine wine culture. So how are we going to break that cycle?
I'm not really sure, to be honest. I think that, well, I do know. There's especially in the United States, it's really, really exciting at the moment. The amount of women who are organising themselves into sort of doing very high level professional development and offering ladders to other women is really, really exciting. And so women in the US are starting to form groups around tasting groups and around businesses which are aimed at women and so on, which are taking women seriously. And that's what's really missing in a lot of the world of wine, is that people want to sell women wine, but they don't want to take them seriously. And if I could change one thing, it would be that. And unfortunately, the really awful thing is I've seen women who enter the world of wine who absorb the same message, which is that the consumer, when you talk about the consumer, she's assumed to be this person that goes to supermarkets and loads up on cheap pale rosé, and that's the start and the finish of her.
That's a problem that is also unique to the wine industry. It seems to be that once you have managed to enter the wine industry, whether as a professional or a consumer, and climbed, out of this pit of ignorance, wine people very quickly forget what it was like to still be inside the pit. So it's great to hear that there are people who are turning around, looking back and going, well, I can find a way in order to develop people, to upskill. That's a way to change the industry. But what you mentioned there is women helping women. And I want to know, how are men able to get involved, or in the sense that there seems to be a lot of things that men naturally don't understand or regularly get wrong. I wondered if you could give a little bit of insight into two or three of the most annoying things that you just wish that men got right, so that those who are wanting to join the fight in order to see women not patronized, in order to see wine better marketed towards them, and also to see the fine wine space just be more inviting to women, what are some of the things they can begin to change?
Well, it depends on where you're talking about, of course. So if you're talking about continental Europe, where I live, oh my God, there's such a long way to go. Men regularly still have conferences where they just invite other men and things like that. In the Anglo-Saxon world, in places like Britain and America and Australia and New Zealand, it's very, very different. No man would have a conference and would dare to leave women out, like they're quite happy to in places like Italy. I think it's just taking consumers seriously and assuming that women will be interested in, and when I say fine wine, I don't mean investment grade wine. I mean sort of artisanal, interesting wines that are not necessarily expensive, but which are just the more interesting and well-made wines. Is just assuming that women are like everybody else and will be interested in that. And I think that's I mean, you're bringing up a really big topic, which is across the whole industry, what to do about women's representation. It's an interesting question. It's vast, but what men can do specifically is take women's taste seriously and not assume that it's all going to be sort of crappy products.
I suppose maybe to narrow it down a bit, what I probably wasn't wording very well is there are men who are very excited about seeing equality in the industry, and wanting to see women uplifted, and wanting to get involved in changing this industry for the better. And yet there will still be faux pas that they make unwittingly. So I wondered if there was something that, or there were particular issues that even vex you as to, look, these guys are doing their best. Why are they still getting this stuff wrong? What are those elements?
Do you know what? Things used to really bug me, even as long ago as sort of 10 years ago. I just used to shake my head at the sexism and the just the thoughtless stereotyping that used to go. Maybe it's my age, but I see less of that now. I think a lot more men are a lot more careful about things like mansplaining and talking over women. The really big issue across the wine trade is still sexual harassment, and unfortunately, that's not something that that's a really difficult thing to tackle, because men who are likely to be predatory are not very open about it typically. But sexual harassment is probably the really big one, and it's exacerbated in this industry by the fact that there's alcohol involved as well.
That is a massive issue. It was the topic of a webinar that we had last year. It was really interesting to see how um, there was a huge divide between younger women and older women, where younger women felt this as an enormous issue, and some of the older women almost felt like it had been solved as a problem. And that felt quite jarring as well, that there was a gap between seemingly younger women needing support and women who'd been in the industry for longer not seeing it as a problem.
Speaking as a very firmly older middle-aged woman, I can tell you that sexual harassment is absolutely a problem, and it's a problem globally. And the stories that I've heard that people have told me are absolutely hair-raising. And if I could tackle one thing, it would be sexual harassment in this industry, and it goes on a lot. And unfortunately, it's exacerbated by the fact that alcohol is involved, and so it gives predators a way out. They can just say, "Oh, there's a misunderstanding, or there was alcohol involved, or she was drinking, or whatever." I think if I could solve that, so all this other stuff about men saying the wrong thing or doing the wrong thing, that stuff is kind of trivial, and you can deal with it. It just pales into comparison with the real issue, which is sexual harassment.
If we pull back and take a wider view of things, I guess my hope is that if we can better represent women in the wine industry to the point where they are equally represented, or it's 50-50, there is a shift in the power dynamic. And I spoke to winemaker Sam O'Keefe, who talked about in South Africa, currently, if she's at a winemakers meeting, there might be 2 or 3 women in a room of 50 men. And so certain jokes get cracked, and there's an atmosphere that is just not helpful. Yet she was saying if there were 25 women in that room with 25 men, the entire atmosphere of the room would be different. So perhaps in some senses, just getting that representation up can help to shift the dynamic that causes or that allows that sort of behavior to go unnoticed and unchecked.
Yeah, I mean, I think those kinds of jokes being made in the presence of women is a form of sexual harassment as well. It's a way of saying, this space belongs to us, and it doesn't belong to you.
Yeah, no, exactly. Well, Felicity, I know that there's so much more that can be discussed right now. We could go on all day, but I also know that you have a lot of things to get going with. I wondered if there are any thoughts you perhaps wanted to share before we end off.
Yes, I do. I think that there is one big change that's happening, which isn't remarked on very often, but I think should be discussed more. Which is that we're in the middle of a major transition at the moment. So it's to do with baby boomers retiring, and so what's happening across Europe is that as the baby boomers retire, they're leaving their wineries, or they're handing over their wineries to the next generation. And for the first time in history, the next generation include women. So it used to be in the past that property was never handed on to daughters. It was always handed on to sons. And for the first time in history, properties are being handed over to daughters. So what we're seeing across the wine world in Europe is we're seeing a massive feminization of wine happening. And we've never seen this before historically. And it's beginning to accelerate at the moment as wineries change hands. And I think it's one of the most extraordinary and historic moments that nobody has kind of noticed.
That is really exciting. How is it manifesting itself? When you're saying this wide-scale feminization of wine, what sort of things might an outsider pick up?
Okay, well, have a look at some of the really big properties in France. We're talking about Chateau Lafite, we're talking about Taittinger Champagne, we're talking about Gaia and Antinori. These very, very famous properties are all being passed to daughters. They're now being run by women. Women are now sort of at the helm of some of the most prestigious and important parts of the wine industry that have ever existed. And that's not just happening at the top end, it's happening in little wineries as well. It's happening all the way across the continent. It's actually not just happening in wine, it's happening in other businesses as well. But wine is moving into the hands of women in a way that we haven't seen before. And I think that's going to turn everything on its head.
That is enormously exciting. And I look forward to be able to see what those changes look like in the actual product itself, both in how wines are made, but also how they're communicated. I still think there's a long way to go, as we've discussed. But thank you so much, Felicity. And again, appreciate so much of your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
We've reached the end of another episode of the Vidimark podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing to the channel so that you can join us for more conversations around wine commerce, wine science, cellar mastery, marketing, and the rising trends amidst the industry's more adventurous pioneers.